Recording in progress.
Looks like the new Zoom account is working. That's good. Can you hear me okay? Is the sound working? Yes. Yep. Okay. Okay, everybody, most people. Well, sorry, many things to say. I wanted to just say quickly, first of all, John Ueki, I want to acknowledge your email. Oh, you can't hear me. Oh, I'll have to wait on that. What's going on with his volume? Maybe. Hey, John. But I'll do that at the end then. Anyway. Let's just look. You usually do this. We usually with this series of classes, we've been taking a couple minutes at the beginning of class just to meditate on something from a previous class. So let's just contemplate together for a moment, and it's to help cultivate bodhicitta motivation. So we'll use one of the images that we're going to reflect on more today anyway. Um, obviously it's an image that comes from the Uttara Tantra itself. So we'll think about so the image here, right, is gold. Right? So Buddha nature is in this simile is pure gold, and the way my trade describes it as if pure gold that was dropped in filth, and like so it's buried under dirt and filthy, materials. So we relate this first to ourselves, right? That so the metaphor here is we don't see our own Buddha nature, right? Because it's covered over, but it's there. And no matter how much filth is at any given moment is covering over our Buddha nature, it's still pure gold. So like, however long it's in filth, however much filth, none of that penetrates into the nature of gold. The gold still remains gold. So oftentimes I only see the mental afflictions. But even as, which are like filth, right? But even as the mental afflictions are manifest, underneath them is that golden Buddha nature. It's been there at my worst moments. It's been there each moment, and it's there now. And the mental afflictions, actually, the Buddha nature is there, right? Like within the mental afflictions. The naturally abiding Buddha nature is always there. Hmm. . And if I remove, so in this metaphor, like somebody points out to the person, uh, like so there's travel, somebody's out on the road and somebody says to them, "Oh, there's gold right there." You know, God, let's say it in the text. Somebody, a God endowed with divine eye, right? So some divine being can see the gold under the mud, under the filth, and tells somebody, he wants them to be rich, right? Or she wants them to be rich, so tells them. So that's like us, right? Maitreya here is telling us, right? Telling each of us underneath the filth of your mental afflictions, your pride, your anger, your craving, jealousy, and so on, your ignorance, underneath them is this golden Buddha nature, this gold-like Buddha nature. All you have to do is uncover it. And Maitreya teaches us how to uncover it. So that's the simile here, right? So I'm like that, I think. I'm somebody who didn't know that there was this, that the source of all wealth, or enough, plenty of wealth was right there. Now, uh, Maitreya and Buddha pointed out to me that I have this Buddha nature within me. They teach the method to uncover it. And so I myself can become a Buddha simply by applying that method, those methods. And everyone else is just like me in that way. Everyone else also has Buddha nature. So I'm this being who's incredibly fortunate, right? Who's been wandering in samsara endlessly, but now has come across, right? Like this circumstance where somebody pointed out to me that I have this Buddha nature, that all others have this Buddha nature. And if I uncover my Buddha nature by applying the methods, like cleaning the gold off, by digging it up and cleaning it off, then I can not only help myself, but I can help countless others. Just contemplate like that for a moment. But that's the simile for our circumstance. We're the fortunate one who had it pointed out to us. The gold is right there. The method is in our hands. You know, just say right here. The gold is right here. And so with that in mind, we cultivate bodhicitta, right? This wish to achieve Buddhahood, right, for the welfare of, so accomplish the welfare of all beings, ourselves and others. So we wish to apply the method of, the methods of love, compassion, wisdom, six perfections, and the six perfections in order to uncover that gold, right? And use it to be of great benefit to ourselves and all others. That's what that kind of motivation will do. We all say that verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Yet. I hope that's starting to give a sense that, all these different similes, that's what, they're for actual contemplation, right? They're for meditating on, they're for practice. Um, and then for those of you who are following the text, we're like a little past halfway down on page 21. Um, and so I had said at the beginning of covering discussing these nine similes that we were gonna go in the way Maitreya does, right? So Maitreya kind of described first he went through each one, and now he's going to go through them again in various ways. It says here individual explanations of the phenomena illustrated by the similes. So he's going to give us more to reflect. If we're going to use them for contemplation and meditation, he's giving more options of things to contemplate. And you can contemplate any of these you want, right? In any given session, so it's not like you have to use all of them. It's not sorry, it's not rigid, but it's like things to use in your contemplation as your. So you can just stay with the metaphor and reflect on it as Buddha nature in general, which is what he did first, right? Now he's going to go into some individual correlations for more reflection, for deeper reflection, for particular reflections, you could say. So he says types of obscurations of the basic element, right? So first he's saying there were nine things that cover over or obscure in these, right? Like the decaying lotus was the first one, the swarm of bees, and so on, right? These things that kind of block. Um, and so he's saying here he's going to get into that's the word, that there are certain kinds, you can contemplate certain kinds of things that cover over one's Buddha nature, right? And those different things that block the filth, the pile of dirt, whatever, you can think in general they're the mental afflictions, of course, and the imprints, or you can be more specific, and these are going to be some more specific reflections here. So his verse, he says, the division of obscurations into nine defining characteristics. And I'll just read the verse and I'll explain it. There are two verses, I guess. He says, attachment, anger, ignorance, could say in their dormant states, their forceful arising, the abandonments of the path of meditation and the path of seeing, and those pertaining to the pure and impure grounds, are well illustrated by the nine similes, the covering of a lotus and so forth. But the divisions of the shells of subsidiary afflictions go beyond the limits of division. Um, so what is he saying there? He's saying, first of all, he's listing these different nine examples, right, of things that can be correlated. But I'll start with where he ends. He says, the divisions of the shells or the things that cover over. So what he's saying is, in general, if you think of what covers over beings, Buddha nature, uh, there are limitless examples of that, is one point he makes, right? And actually, I wrote it down. Asanga, I just want to share two quotes about that. Asanga, in his commentary, says that sometimes in Buddhist texts there are listed 84,000 afflictions. Right? And he says Asanga says there are 84,000 afflictions that could be enumerated, uh, that cover over your Buddha nature, and here they're going to be categorized in nine categories. And Gyaltsab he mentions in the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, the essence of the Tathagata Sutra, that there are limitless, that the Tathagata Garbha itself, the Buddha nature, right, the essence of a Tathagata or seed of a Tathagata, is concealed by limitless coverings of afflictions, right? So he says limit the 84,000, and this is limitless. 84,000 is a real number that's sometimes taught in Buddhist scriptures, but Gyaltsab says it could also be, you could have numberless. And actually, if you look around, right, like what they're getting at is just on the one hand, you can think of different mental afflictions, specific ones, which we're going to talk about. But actually, if you get into the finer elaborations, right, like actually, it's kind of funny. It's sad, isn't it? Like, if you contemplate what they're saying, if you just look at yourself and then you look at the people around you, it's actually true, isn't it? Once you get caught up in mental afflictions, there are limitless versions of them, right? You can actually it's like what's the to say, right? Sometimes if you step back and think about it, if you like contemplate your own mental afflictions, that's better. And also those around us, like it's actually weird. Like people actually you can become, what's the word, like crazy in a limitless number of ways. Like you can, like and like if you look at the things people hate about, or the things people crave after, or the things people are arrogant about, right? Like it's unbelievable, actually, right? Like, it really is. And so, I mean, just that alone, that one line, you can actually sit and think about quite a bit, isn't it? Like, yeah, it's just weird, isn't it? Like people could actually hate each other because like you didn't like my shoes or something, right? Like it's like you could just make up any kind of. I mean, there really is. It's like there's no end to how many different. It's just like weird if you contemplate, and then and it's easy. Again, it's always easier to see that in somebody else, but we're all like that. Is what's odd, right? Like we're, oh, somebody said this, or oh, I like that, or So my point is like those are all just the dirt, and what's interesting here, right, is that you contemplate and you go, okay, there are limitless different versions of what and we kill each other over those things, and we make wars over them, and we hate each other, and we do all kinds of things. And then in this teaching, right, you step back and you go, oh, and that's just the dirt that you're supposed to be getting rid of to uncover the gold or the statue or the whatever. Like, um, it's quite a useful method, isn't it? To just think about that, like to go, wow. So I elaborate. We sometimes call it elaborations, right? Mental. Once you have self-grasping, there are all these different mental elaborations, and you can elaborate anything, which is bizarre. You can make, and people do, right? Like, it's like if you look at like human history, we do that, and we ourselves do that individually, and here, what you're supposed one of the contemplations is like all of that, right? Because the gold is actually emptiness, right? That's what I mean. The naturally abiding Buddha nature is the emptiness of the mind itself. So we miss that. And once we miss that and we get too self-grasping, we can elaborate all kinds of anything, actually. We can make up any kind of story. And based on those different stories, we give rise to countless different variations of the mental afflictions. Um, and so just that is amazing to contemplate, right? Each of these verses you can really like sit and think about, and it'll help you develop a sense. It helps me at least. It's supposed to help us develop, a sense of like wonder and a sense of inspiration and a sense of sorrow, even at how we sometimes do it. And if we apply this to ourselves, then that's quite good. We apply that insight, go, wow, I don't want to do that anymore. And then trying to say whether yeah, here I'll pause. I'm going to do it the way I'm going to pause here and go into the details. Okay, so he says, so he lists here. First, he says attachment, anger, ignorance, and their dormant states. Um, so I'll go over the correspondences, and for that, I will use this chart. The one from the basic program. It was given out at the beginning, 2005 basic program, or that master's program, I guess. Basic program. I guess it's been used in both, but anyway, it's the same as what's in the text. I'm just use it. It's easier to use for talking. Um, oh, okay. But so the first one is uh, right, the decayed lotus, right? Like a kind of decayed lotus that's covering over a Buddha form, right? So it's like a Buddha statue or Buddha form that's inside a kind of lotus that was previously quite beautiful, but now is rotting. Um, and actually, it's interesting. Coming up are going to be verses again explaining these, but I'm going to do it separate because that's the way he did it, and I think it's quite nice. So here he's correlating to specific kinds of mental affliction. So he says that one is the dormant state of attachment. So what does that mean, actually, a dormant state of attachment? And what these come from the Buddha, Maitreya explained, but they come from the sutra. And so what the Buddha is getting at here, what Maitreya is getting at here, is that these first three, right? So the lotus, the swarm of bees, and the husk of the grain symbolize. It can be taken to symbolize. Let's put it that way. What he's calling the dormant state of attachment, the dormant state of hatred, and the dormant state of ignorance. So what are those dormant? What do I mean by dormant state? And so what that's getting at is when somebody's in a meditative concentration, right? They haven't abandoned the mental afflictions, but the mental afflictions, if they're in deep meditation, enter a dormant state. They're not active. Uh, and this is getting at that kind of experience. So, and what actually what Asanga says about that is he says when you're, for example, if you achieve the dhyanas, right, which are the four levels of concentration after you've achieved calm abiding, your anger is completely dormant at that point. There is no manifest anger. Uh, the others can be dormant, or there can be subtle levels of them. But what's created then is what's called an immovable karma, the term Buddhist teachings on karma. And immovable karma means it's a karma that will give rebirth to either a rebirth that will give uh, be a cause of rebirth in either the form realm or the formless realm. We're not in the formless realm. We're in the desire realm, which we're going to get to in a minute. But these are the form and formless realms are realms of experience that come about, the cause of which is meditative concentration. That makes sense. So like when we take birth in the desire realm, usually the cause is some kind of the active karmic cause, the action that causes that is either a virtuous or a non-virtuous behavior, right? Like generosity might give rise to a good rebirth. Killing will give rise to a bad rebirth.
Yeah.
Um, but but so those are karmic causes that are that create that create rebirth and desire. But karmic causes that create rebirth in the form or formless realms, the cause of those is an experience of meditative concentration. So, for example, if a person achieves the first dhyana, right, which is related to one of the lowest of the four levels of the form realm, that's the first, right? Then the second would be the second level, the form, third, the third, and so on. Um, that the person who's engaging in that kind of meditation in this life, like a yogi, let's say, it could be a Buddhist yogi, a Hindu yogi, some other yogi. Uh, if they, if they're just like sort of, and they kind of, they, if they enter into that experience of that first dhyana, that's a karma, right? It's an action. It's an action of mind. It's not an action of body or speech. And that action of mind will give rise to a result. That result will be a rebirth in the form realm. By the way, that's not always true because a bodhisattva, for example, who does that out of great compassion, then they're not, they're dedicating it to enlightenment, so not to rebirth in the form realm. But an ordinary person, well, who has that kind of concentration, it's just a karma, right? And that's why I mentioned there can be a subtle attachment to the form realm, actually, but that's a very subtle level of attachment. And then actually you have to kind of let go of that in order to achieve the second level. Part of the process of going from the first level of form to the second is recognizing the second level is better. So I want to achieve the second level. And then you kind of shift your concentration and you become a little more subtle and you achieve that and so on. And there are the formless realms are more subtle than those. And the reason they call them immovable, by the way, I think if I remember right in teachings, is that uh, they what's the word? Uh, immediately give rise to that kind of rebirth, after death. So if the person has achieved that in this life and sort of wants to go back to that realm, they can immediately go back there. That's sort of karma that will definitely, and it'll definitely give rise to that kind of thing. It's not, doesn't give rise to some other result, any other kind of result either. Uh, and part of what this is getting at, by the way, is that so those kinds of meditative states, one point that's being gotten at here is that you still have attachment, anger, and ignorance. They're just dormant, right? They're on hold. It's like Janet pressed pause on the record. It's like you put pause on the mental afflictions through your concentration, but you haven't stopped them. So it's just a temporary break from them. It's more pleasant, they say, or experience, but they say it's more pleasant than the desire realm. But but it's not a permanent stop, and you're still under the influence of those. In other words, they're still dormant. They're still there, and they still cover your Buddha nature. So you don't see your Buddha nature in that instance. Uh, you're not seeing the empty nature of your mind. You're just seeing the experience of the form realm or the experience of the formless realm. Uh, and it's a kind of, by the way, one other point I'll make is those rebirths in the form and formless realm are categorized as God rebirths. So it's categorized as being in the God realm. There are desire realm gods, form realm gods, and formless realm gods. And it's just a kind of rebirth. I mean, God in the sense that God realm, not greater God or something like that. But that's what that's categorized as. So this is that kind of rebirth.
But I mean, we can talk. I think we can talk for a minute. I think I understand it. Being born a human in the desire realm is ideal for practicing Dharma and attaining Buddhahood. So it sounds like, as wonderful as it might be to be able to attain that kind of meditative concentration, if you are then reborn in a form or formless realm, it's a bit of a detour.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess one point I'll make too, just to further elaborate on what you're asking. So, yeah, if you take rebirth in those realms, that's not as helpful as human rebirth for practice. Um, Bodhisattvas do visit those realms as part of their practice and so on. But the main difference is this: is one point I'll make is like so say right, if you develop meditative concentration and just focus on those realms, and you develop a kind of subtle attachment to those realms, you'll take rebirth there, and that's actually not helpful for your progress necessarily. But there are, I guess, what's there to say, right? For example, like our people on the path of an arhat, who are trying to achieve individual liberation. Uh, there's a process where they go through those realms in order to abandon attachment to them. So there are different purposes for going to those realms. So somebody who's trying to achieve their own individual liberation will sometimes enter those realms in order to recognize I don't want to be attached to this realm, for example. And bodhisattvas will enter those realms because they need to be able to go through all the different experiences. So there are different purposes that people visit, or they'll have the experiences of those realms, you could say. But yeah, the purpose is not for a Buddhist practitioner. One's not aiming to take rebirth in them. That's right.
So, what's the purpose of practicing concentrated meditation? I guess I mean, that is a good or bad thing. Why is it encouraged in practice?
I guess I'll say, Junior, like there is what this is getting at in a way. I mean, not this, but in general, what we're talking about is that there are beings who uh, take rebirth in those realms because they want to, because that's their goal. That's not goal in Buddhist practice. But there are a couple points. One is, I guess, well, going back to your question, you actually asked why I develop meditative concentration. In Buddhist practice, there are a few points. One is, let's say it the way. To develop certain realizations of the Buddhist path, you have to achieve calm abiding. And then you have to use those subtle states of concentration to. So, for an example, would be to gain the direct realization of emptiness. Like you have to be able to enter those kinds of experiences and then use those subtle states of minds to meditate on emptiness. So you would actually contemplate emptiness first while you're in the desire realm. You might realize it, even to gain some kind of level, but you wouldn't be able to realize it directly unless you develop those kind of concentrated states and then meditated on emptiness in that way. Same with subtle impermanence. Like you could contemplate how everything changes instant by instant on a gross level. Like we can think about that now and we can recognize, yeah, everything really does. It's nothing lasts for a second, even a second, unchanging. But but they say that when you have calm abiding and develop those kinds of concentrations, and then you meditate on subtle impermanence, you have a different kind of level of transformation because your mind is very powerful when you're meditating on it. And so you can realize it in a different experiential way.
Okay.
So from a Buddhist perspective, that's why you're developing those concentration states, is to develop the realizations in the path, actually.
Okay. That makes sense.
When you're calling these realms, so if you're going to say the form, for example, so is that something like I guess I call it like a different dimension or something in that we as human people would not see them, or is it, I guess, a fully mental thing?
Good question. Yeah, so I don't know if people heard that. He was saying like are those like realms in the sense of like almost like different dimensions of experience and different places almost. And the idea is in Buddhism is that the form realms are actually yeah like places that we don't experience because only beings with that level of concentration experience them. But yeah, it's like a different dimension or different place, and sometimes they even say it's like somewhere, you know, there's some place, we can experience them because we don't have that level of, I don't know. To experience that, you have to have a certain level of concentration in your mind, but then once you have a kind of subtle form that's there and it's kind of made of subtler matter than ours. It's a different, so you can almost, it's almost like science fiction, right? Like there's like you have a different kind of body made of a different kind of substance that, is subtler. The formless realms are different though. In the Sutrayana teachings, they say those beings actually don't have bodies. They're in a kind of, so that in that sense, they're not in a place because there's no body to be in that place. It's pure. Those are purely mental. You could say those are like so. One of them is the concentration on nothingness, for example, or the concentration. There are different of those four. They have different names, and that's where a being develops so much deep concentration on neither like space or nothingness or something that when they die, they enter a kind of realm of just the mind absorbed in space or the mind absorbed in nothingness. And they stay there for however long that immovable karma threw them there, and then they fall down and take another rebirth. So in that sense, those aren't places in the sense that there's no body, but they're realms of mental experience. So your answer is both, depending on which. It's the form realm or like a different, but it's both of those. Yeah.
I guess to follow, so is that a fully separate, either of those, a fully separate rebirth, or is that something like if you meditated deeply enough, you would enter one of those, and so I could still see your body here, but then you would be somewhere else. I guess is what I was trying to get.
And again, both. Like so, in other words, a person in this life like in this life, if you develop calm abiding and you continue to develop meditative concentration, you yourself could enter, say, one of the formless realms, and then like Ryan might look over and go, "Oh, but I still see his body right there," But your inner experience would be totally disconnected from your body at that point. You'd be completely in a different realm of experience, but somebody in the desire realm might still see your body. This immovable karma point, though, is that uh, if you were doing that not with bodhicitta, but just in general, because you like meditation, let's say, uh, then when you died, you would take that immovable karma would throw you to rebirth there. Then your body might be buried or cremated, whatever. Let's say it was cremated, for example, would be gone, but your consciousness would then be in that realm. And then nobody in this realm would see you. They would think, "Oh, whatever happened to him? I wonder, maybe he's in heaven, maybe he's in whatever, whatever their belief was." But you would be in this experience of whatever that realm was that you had meditated on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then John has a
Yeah,
John.
thanks. I just want to make sure I'm on the right track. So we're talking about overt. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I was just turning up the volume so people here can. I guess that's the highest spot. Yep. Okay.
So
Yep.
we're talking about overt and dormant mental afflictions. And the way I'm understanding this, and this is what I want to clarify and make sure I'm getting this right, is that the dormant mental afflictions refer to the first obstacle that we need to purify. And that by doing that, we can achieve the nirvana of an arhat. But above and beyond that, with regard to the dormant mental afflictions, those are the ground of those subtle instinctive predispositions that are not overt, not active at the moment, but they're nonetheless still serving as an obstacle, that second obstacle that we need to purify in order to reach actual Buddhahood. So do you think those correlate?
No, that's not. You'll see, because actually, we're gonna get to those. That'll be number 5. Like this is if I'm going in order of these 9 similes. The one you mentioned, I think, would be the latencies of ignorance, which is actually number 5. So we'll get to that. And so these three aren't the first three. Actually, the fourth one will be the first one that we have to eliminate. The first three, actually, and this is one point. Actually, you're raising some good questions, I think. So it's good to reflect on. It implies something, which is, let's say this right. These 9 categories of mental afflictions overlap. So, for example, the fourth one is the intense outburst of mental afflictions. That's the one actually we experience most. Is active mental afflictions. And so for us, we said first, like we're gonna have to eliminate those first, because that's what we actually experience because we're in the desire realm. So here it's just saying, it's just sort of raising this point that these 3 levels of the dormant mental afflictions are also need to be removed. But they're not our main obstacle because we actually have the active ones, which are even more disturbing. So they're not the first to be removed; they're just the first mentioned here. That makes sense. And they're not the obstacles to omniscience. I think that's what you were getting at. Those come later actually, and those also are number 8 are the obstacles to omniscience technically of the 9. So these are just the first ones mentioned, and they're particularly ones that are dormant state. You'll see though that when we get to the metaphor of it, that these first 3 you can also apply them to active states of it, in my view. But if you're going to
Yes,
do
sir.
this level of kind of analysis, then it's referring to a specific experience, which is the dormant state.
Okay, so there is a distinction then between the dormant state of mental afflictions and that ground of instinctive predispositions.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah,
you?
and hopefully you'll see when we get to number 8, those will be that's where,
Wait, I'm not
because
clear.
I guess I'll say it this way, like a difference is one way of describing the difference like you're getting at is that in the dormant state there is still use a metaphor. I'm gonna try to explain it using it like a traditional one way they sometimes do it is the dormant state would be like this. Like if you had uh the obstacles to omniscience, I think that you're getting at, which are like the subtle imprints of ignorance, but those are still present even when ignorance has been removed, like in an arhat, or in somebody on the 8th bhumi or an arhat. Here, these dormant states, they're ordinary samsaric beings. They're still talking about a level of ordinary samsaric beings where you still have not just the imprints of something, but the seeds of it. In other words, you'll still give rise to it. So like, yeah, the traditional metaphor, they sometimes, I've mentioned this one before, but the difference would be like, here, I'm going to use a silly metaphor for a second, but here it's like, sometimes when you first buy garlic, it's not growing, it's not sprouting, but it still could sprout, right? And if you, like, so that's like this, the dormant state, right? It's not sprouting, but it still has the potential to sprout. The subtle imprints are what they call, like, they sometimes use the metaphor, the garlic can't sprout anymore, it's just the smell that's left, right? It's like if you kept garlic for many years in a jar, and then now you've gotten rid of all the garlic from that jar, but there's still a smell of garlic. So what you're getting at the imprints, the traditional one metaphor for that is that's like the smell left over. It's a subtle imprint left by the mental afflictions. Whereas here, the mental afflictions are just dormant; they can come back. This isn't the subtle imprint left by them. This is just where they're kind of temporarily suppressed.
So the
So that's
seeds
the
have
difference.
either been scorched or not scorched, right?
Yeah, these are non-scorched seeds. These are just seeds that are like, under what's the word? Under refrigeration. They may be in a freezer, so to speak. I'm metaphorically speaking. If you stuck the seeds in a freezer, they're not going to sprout. But if you take them out of the freezer and you plant them and you apply some heat, they'll sprout again. That's this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whereas the ones you're talking about are after the seeds are burnt. There's still some like soot there, is another metaphor you can say.
Mhm.
And then somebody else has their hand. Oh, John also has different John. John Hanson.
Yeah, maybe I'm confused with this because I missed the last couple of classes. Sorry. When you talk about the dormant state of those 3 being part of the 9 mental afflictions. Are there 2 different versions and those are 3 of them, or is that 6 of them? Because there's an active and there's a dormant.
Oh, so
Part of
maybe
attachment.
tell me if this answers it. So then the fourth one, right, which is the gold, the one we meditate on, the gold under filth. That, according to going back to this verse, right? It says, I'll go back to the verse. It says, first it says attachment, anger, and ignorance in their dormant state. That's going, if we go through the 9, that's number 1, number 2, and number 3. Each of those 3 in their dormant state. And then number 4 is their forceful arising. So number 4 is the active state, actively being angry, actively being craving and desirous, or actively being ignorant. So number 4 is all of those, any of the mental afflictions in their active state. Does that answer it? What you were asking, or is that not completely?
No, I think that answers it actually, because so there's, as a dormant, there's a separate item. When you move into active, they all get kind of grouped together.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's the
That
way he
answers
did
the
it.
question,
Yeah,
then. Yes, thank you.
and then Wilhelmina.
Lauren, there was a time that I was in long retreat of a month, and I went through different stages, ending up in the very end with going completely out of my bar. And there was a prediction. And when I got out, I had to ask Lama Zopa what to do. And he advised me to get Chuka at the time.
You get what? I couldn't hear the last. He advised me to get
somebody, Geshe-Chuka, or another Lahai Lama, to get me back in my body to block that. Does that mean that now when I die, I go there first? Or can I go directly back to the earth?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure. To be honest, if I knew, I mean, I don't know. But in your case, I don't think that means you'll take rebirth there necessarily. I think in your case, knowing you, I would think a lot of it actually depends on how you dedicate, and what your prayer is, and what your aspiration is, and what your, So I actually think, so like I know you do like certain practices like POA or other practices like that. So I actually think if you I think where you go depends on like how you how you dedicate and what your prayers are, and then also what practice you're doing as you get closer to death. I think that's the key points. So I don't think it's I guess my point is I don't think that like determines that you have to go someplace after you die. It's up to you, I think, to some extent, your karma and your prayers and your aspirations, and also what practices you're doing as you approach death. I think that's more important. But I'm not sure exactly what if Lama Zopa saw something I don't know, but I think in general that would be true. It's not like you have to take. And also in your case, you practice with bodhicitta. So if you think about bodhicitta, then that's the most powerful force. Actually,
yeah, it was a medicine Buddha retreat that I did 2 months, and yeah, it developed into a lot more.
Yeah. I think the main thing is, but like, I'm just thinking of what Rebbe Rinpoche used to say, right? It's like, let bodhicitta be your guide, and then that will determine your rebirth, and that will determine your path, that will determine your goal, that will determine everything. So I actually think that's the end. It's bodhicitta is
Thank you.
That will determine it. I think so. Personally, that's my thing. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'll keep going through this list. So, okay, so I already got to the fourth one then, right? Which is the active state. So the active state of those three is the metaphor is the filth, right? And that gives the active state of the mental afflictions is what gives rise to rebirth in the desire realm, which is our realm. And one thing that was interesting, I had to pause and think about it, is the commentary said, oh, actually, where did it say the fourth one? Creates rebirth in the desire realm, the upper and lower of the 6 realms. So I had to go, okay, wait a second. So the active form of mental afflictions can give rise to rebirth in the lower realms, obviously, right? If you, for example, if you kill out of hatred, that's going to give rebirth. That's going to cause rebirth in lower realms. But then it's how does an active form of the mental afflictions give rise to rebirth in the upper realms? Right, like human, for example, mentioned human realms good, or the desire realm gods, and so on. So how does an active mental affliction give rise to a rebirth in the higher realms of the desire realm? An example there would be ignorance, or is that somebody who has an active form of self-grasping. I'll give an example. Like, so let's say you're actively self-grasping at yourself, and then you think, well, I don't want to do bad things because I want to have a good rebirth. And so you go out and help people. But there's still active self-grasping. That would be an example. So you're doing positive karma, but it's under the influence of self-grasping. So it's going to give you rebirth. An active self-grasping is going to cause rebirth. It's not going to cause enlightenment. It's going to cause rebirth within desire. So even rebirth in the higher realms of the desire realm is under the influence of an active ignorance, actually. If we're beyond ignorance, then it's a different kind of karma, which we're going to get to. And then the fifth one, which is treasure under the earth, right? The first one was filth, like dirt, like poop or something. The fifth one is treasure under the ground. And that one is the latencies of ignorance, right? Yeah, that's what they call it. And it says, this is in the continuum of aryas. The latencies of ignorance produces a kind of uncontaminated karma that gives rise to what we talked about this before in this text. That gives rise to the mind-made bodies of an arya. And those we covered it because it says in the text earlier. We already studied this that those mind-made bodies are pure in the sense that they're not they don't suffer the way samsaric beings suffer, but they're still dualistic because they're produced by the latencies of ignorance, right? So this is an example of what John was getting at, the latencies. These are not just, this is more, it's drawing that distinction. This is not just dormant ignorance. At this point, ignorance, this is like the latencies of ignorance in the sense of like the imprints of ignorance that are still cause dualistic perception. And so what it's getting at here is that those who have seen emptiness directly, when they take rebirth, and this is why it's different. The other was immovable karma. This is uncontaminated karma. Uncontaminated karma means it's not under the influence of active ignorance, right? And it's also not under the influence of inactive ignorance because one doesn't give rise to ignorance anymore. At the
So
time
it's
of
only
death.
under the influence of the latency. I mean, the what's left.
It varies actually. If it's an arhat, then it's under the influence of the latencies. Yeah.
Okay.
If it's a bodhisattva, it's also under the latencies of compassion and love and bodhicitta, that they take rebirth in a mind-made body out of their love for beings in order to then manifest to help others. So
Okay, well, all right.
like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is the body of an arhat or an arya bodhisattva. And so it's a subtle dualistic body that still covers over your Buddha nature. That's the point here, right? That kind of body and that kind of that kind of body does, but also that kind of latency of ignorance is still a cover. It's a subtler cover, but it's still a cover over your Buddha nature. It blocks you from seeing it directly at that time. Well, actually, those beings have seen emptiness directly, but they still have this subtle imprint. So when they arise from that meditative concentration, they still see things dualistically. So that's the latency of ignorance. And the karmic seed of that gives rise to these kind of mind-made bodies. But whenever they're not in meditative absorption, directly realizing emptiness, they have dualistic experiences. And that blocks them from, at those moments, seeing their included nature. Then the sixth one, which is the seed, right, covering the fruit, the seed around the fruit, that symbolizes the mental afflictions that are abandoned, right, on the path of seeing. And in this one of the texts here, it says, sometimes they say on the Hinayana path of seeing. But anyway, same difference. I mean, that's in general what they mean. So, and the part of the metaphor there is that it says this in one of the commentaries, that right as the fruit, like if you have a seed, I remember, if you have a seed like planted, right, like for example, sitting in water, do that, then right as it sprouts out, the peel bursts, right, the outer covering bursts open, and that's like the experience of the path of seeing. That as the experience of the path of seeing happens, certain mental afflictions are immediately destroyed. And it's a first experience of that. On the Bodhisattva path, it's called the very joyful ground. It's like this experience of great joy at finally seeing emptiness directly and overcoming certain mental afflictions. And there are certain, and there are various levels of mental afflictions that are abandoned as you progress on the path. And the very first, again, I'm drawing a distinction between the first, what we talked about earlier, which there are states where the mental afflictions become dormant. This is not that. This is where they're actually, the deep cause for them is removed in your being, and that they will no longer arise. And an example of the kind of mental afflictions that are abandoned on the path of seeing are, they say that somebody who has achieved the path of seeing will never again give rise to what are called like intellectually acquired or acquired wrong views. Like we're still susceptible. Ordinary beings are still susceptible. If somebody tells you the wrong thing as a child, or even as an adult, you may believe it. You may get convinced that something wrong is true. Once you've seen emptiness directly, it doesn't, whether you're a child or an adult, from that point forward, in all your rebirths, no matter what somebody tells you, if it's wrong, can't be convinced. If it's a wrong view, you won't get convinced of it because you've seen reality directly yourself. So nobody can convince you otherwise. And that's quite remarkable kind of experience, they say. So that's an example of mental afflictions abandoned on the path of seeing, or the Hinayana path of seeing. Then the seventh, which is the worn out rags, right? What kind of worn out rags that are covering the precious statue. That's a simile for the mental afflictions abandoned on the path of meditation, or the Hinayana path of meditation. And that's like, as you progress on the path, right, you gradually abandon more and more afflictions until you achieve liberation or enlightenment. And by the way, that's the metaphor of the worn out cloth. It's like the image here is that the cloth has like holes in it and it's starting to, it's a dirty old cloth. It's still covering the Buddha statue, but it's starting to like fray, and there are little, might be places where you can like glimpse through. And that's the metaphor, right? Is that you're abandoning more and more mental affliction. So it's still covered, but it's not like right before it was like heavy mud or heavy dirt. Now it's a cloth, which first of all, you kind of pull apart almost, it's like it's falling apart. So you get the metaphor there. Your mental afflictions are getting thinner is the idea, which is a good thing, right? Then the eighth metaphor is the womb, right? That I made some other notes, but I'm not seeing this. Thanks. So the idea there is that oh, there it is. Oh, so anyway, the eighth one is like the womb, and the symbol there is that it's the mental afflictions abandoned on the first seven bhumis of a bodhisattva. And so again, you can get the sense here right now. It's still obscuring, right? but it's developing. Right now, it's like you get the feeling there. It's a different. Before it was like in the mud, right? Now the metaphor is, or the simile rather, is that you still can't see. You can't see the child inside the mother's womb, but the child is growing now, right? So you get the metaphor there. It's like there are still things obscuring your Buddha nature. You're not a Buddha yet, but now you're in a process of developing. So you get the simile is a bit different. It's a different kind of simile. And then the last one, the ninth. So that was on the first 7 Bodhisattva bhumis. Those are called the impure bhumis. The reason why they're called impure is relative to the 8th, 9th, and 10th bhumis, which are called the pure bhumis. And the reason why they call them that is at least in the Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, on the first 7 bhumis, the Bodhisattva still has seeds of mental afflictions. So they can enter their mental afflictions are very weak, I guess you could say. But there are certain, we studied that in certain, I mentioned sometimes, like where like a bodhisattva can still give rise to a moment of desire and then go, oh, how odd. Like, look at that, I gave rise to a moment of desire. Or they can still give rise to a moment of grasping at a self, and then they kind of look at that and go, oh, that's not. And it gets subtler and subtler, and briefer as they're progressing. And because when they go through the bhumis, there are different levels. They sometimes say there are 9 levels of mental afflictions that are abandoned. So there are like gross levels, subtle levels, and very subtle levels. And so in the first, in the early bhumis, you're getting rid of the gross levels, and then the medium, and then the very subtle levels of mental afflictions. But they're not completely gone until when you reach the 8th bhumi, there are no mental afflictions left at all. And so that's why they're called pure in the sense that those beings don't have any mental afflictions. So what's still covering their Buddha nature, and this is, I think, this is getting at John, your question from earlier. On the 3 pure bhumis, what are left are only the subtle imprints of the mental afflictions. And those bodhisattvas are removing those. That it takes 3 bhumis, 3 levels of practice to completely eliminate the subtle imprints of the mental afflictions in order to achieve omniscience. That's what's happening there, according to the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. And so that's describing that. So that's different than the dormant state. That makes sense, John, now? Like, that's what I was referring to there, is that this is where that comes in. So a few things I'll say. One is, so if you think about this, you can see, if you start contemplating it, that these all overlap, right? In other words, the ones on level 9, we have those too. Obviously we have the subtle influence of ignorance, but they're not so relevant for us to remove yet, because you can't really remove those according to Prasangika school until you get to the 8th bhumi, or at the end of the 7th, whatever, until you get to that point. So we have those, there's an overlap, but we need to focus on level 4, right? Number 4, which is the active mental afflictions. Eventually, if we achieve calm abiding, we won't have active mental afflictions, but we're going to need to make sure we get rid of the dormant state. Once we get rid of the dormant state and so on, and both the active and the dormant, we still have the latencies. And so there are many things to get rid of, and it's like peeling away. Somebody had
I just was asking you, what was the 9th simile again? I forget what the.
Oh, the clay mold. That's that one. Okay. And so the clay mold, the image there, by the way, the commentary said the reason why that one is like that final stage is that the gold is now fully formed, right? It's like if you made a golden Buddha statue inside a clay mold, you can't see it yet, right? It's not, you don't see the golden statue, but it just takes you just have to chip away a little bit and it falls down. So it's not, it's a simile for like that you're almost there, or that it's, it's fully formed, and you just have to kind of get rid of those last, it's easier. Right. Still takes a long time in these bhumis if you're not practicing Minus Yoga Tantra, but it still takes one countless great eon. But those are the subtle imprints, the subtle, not subtle, the subtle imprints of the mental afflictions that are abandoned on the last 3 levels or bhumis. So the point is, I just wanted to go through all that because it's in the text, right? And you get the sense now, again, you don't have to contemplate all those, but you get the point here. It's like it's a further elaboration that if you're going to meditate and think about these metaphors or similes rather, you can kind of go, oh wow, there are all these different levels to be abandoned. And I need to abandon them all. And also it's quite useful. If, let's say you achieve calm abiding and you and all of a sudden all your mental afflictions are dormant. It helps you don't get confused, right? You still have mental afflictions to get rid of. And you're not done or something like that, right? They're just dormant. And so on. And if you achieve arhatship, there's still there's still the latencies of ignorance to get rid of. So one point is for us now we can contemplate these. They're also kind of reminders as you progress on the path. There are a lot of levels to remove in order to become a Buddha. So it said, and now we can go back, right? So it said there are limitless different mental afflictions, but here are 9 levels or 9 categories of through the simile that we're going to get rid of. And then it says, summarizing the 9 defilements, attachment, and so forth, they have been well explained in their respective order by the examples of the chalice of the lotus and so on. That's clear. Then he says, by way of those defilements, the childish ordinary beings, Hinayana Arhats, Hinayana Arya learners, and wise Mahayana Aryas are explained to be impure in their respective order by 4, 1, 2, and 2 defilements. Is that clear? It's getting it right. There are 4, it's getting at these 9 levels that I just talked about are describing the experiences of 4 different kinds of beings. So first of all, there are ordinary childish beings. And I always love this. I've said this before, but like a childish being is somebody who's in Buddhism, whenever they use that term, the childish beings, it's referring to people who have not seen emptiness directly. So so in other words, you're not, so you're not really a grown-up, you're not mature until you see emptiness directly. I just love that. So and it's like, because you can see that, right? That the Buddha looks around and goes like feeling a sense of sympathy or compassion, like, oh, the childish beings don't know what they're doing. Like they're running around, like the way if you see you have to protect, like if you like when children are playing, right, they don't know what they're doing, like they might run out in traffic, they might do it, it's like it's kind of like that, right? If you're watching kids at a playground, you have to keep an eye on them because they might run out in traffic, they might climb something and fall because they don't really know yet what they're doing, how to protect themselves. And when the Buddha looks at us, we're childish in that sense, right? Like we don't know what we're doing, and we, trying to make ourselves happy, we may cause a lot of suffering for ourselves and others. So we're childish in that sense.
This is really as somebody with young children, it's really illuminating. I watch my kids try to get what they want and do the exact wrong thing to get it. It wants to watch more TV. I say no more TV, so they starts crying about TV. I say, well, this is exactly why you can't watch more. Childish mistakes. Buddha looks at us and the things that we do to try to make ourselves happy in like the same way, except with probably a lot more compassion.
That's fun. Yeah, and there's that verse in Shantideva. It's like Shantideva says, although they want happiness, they run away from it. And he's talking about childish beings, right? He's not talking about children. He's talking about us. So he says, although they want happiness, they destroy the very cause of happiness. Although they don't want suffering, they run directly towards cause of suffering. Shantideva, and with great compassion in his heart, Shantideva says, that's how sad, how unfortunate, and
So
hopefully
there's potential
Yeah.
for growth.
which is what
They're
this
not
text is
children,
saying.
right.
We can grow up. But so I love that. So we're childish, right? That's us. It says the childish beings, that's us. And so 4, it says that's where, if you look down below, it says 4, right? So that's right. That's the latent forms of desire, the latent form of hatred, the latent form of ignorance, and the active form of all 4. So the first 4 are referring to the ordinary beings experience, what ordinary beings have that obscure our Buddha nature mainly, right? Is those. We also have all the other things, but that's the main obstacles for us. Then it says the Hinayana Arhats. So that's referring, right? The Hinayana Arhat has number 5, which was the ground, which was the symbol of the latencies of ignorance. That's all they have, right? The latency. They don't have any mental afflictions because they're Arhat, right? They've overcome all the mental afflictions, but they still have all the latencies of ignorance. So that covers over their Buddha nature. So they have 1. Then it says Next one is 2, right? And it's for the Hinayana Arya learners, right? Those on the Hinayana path. So it has 2 because it's numbers 5 and 6, which are the ground and the seed, which are the mental afflictions to be abandoned on the path of seeing of the Hinayana path, and the mental afflictions to be abandoned on the path of meditation. So those are the things that are still to be removed by those who are on the Hinayana path but are not yet arhats. And then there are 2 for the wise, which means Mahayana Aryas, right? So that's when it says it's contrasting with childish, right? There are the childish beings, like us, ordinary people, and then the wise are those bodhisattvas who have seen objects directly. So the Mahayana Aryas, or the wise beings, and they have 2 also, which are numbers 8 and 9. The mental afflictions to be abandoned on the first 7 bodhisattva bhumis, the impure bhumis, and then number 9, which are the mental afflictions to be abandoned on the pure last 3 bhumis. And though that's what's still covering over the Buddha nature of the wise ones, right? That even they have obscurations. And you see my point from earlier, these overlap. Like, do we still have the obscurations that the wise Arya Bodhisattvas have? Yes. But they're not the emphasis, because we have the gross form of it. Eventually we have to remove those as well. So these all overlap, but they're a point of emphasis here, right? And so you see the point here of this 4 kinds of beings. And again, I always laugh when I contemplate. If I sit down and contemplate this, I'm like, in the, say it right. If you, I guess, if you ordinary people don't categorize beings in these 4 ways, right? Everybody else is childish, and then there are the beings who have seen reality directly, of different categories. We ordinarily categorize beings in other ways, right? According to different other criteria. This is quite a nice way to categorize beings. It's more, you can see how actually this way of categorizing beings is based in compassion, right? How close are you to being free from suffering? And how do you free yourself from suffering? A lot of times the way we or childish beings categorize beings is not connected to compassion, but is connected to ignorance. So it's a useful, actually, I just find it fun. Again, if you sit and contemplate these things, it's like, wow, what if I were just to go around, like, if I were to make my main category of beings, like the childish ones, the arhats, the Hinayana learners, and the Mahayana learners. Right? And then hopefully you come across quite a few of the arhats and Mahayana learners. If you'll come across a lot of those in your life. But anyway, that's that verse. And then it says correspondence and the similes of the basic element obscurations. So this is still about, you get all of this is, the reason why I'm going over it in this way, and I want to do it the way in the order he does it, is he's giving point after point I hope it feels like that, for contemplation, like something to think about, right? Something to contemplate. So now he's going to give more to contemplate. We'll cover just a little, we have time, a little more. So now he's going to go through all 9 again. So this is number 1, first again, right? And he says, just as the presence of a lotus born from mud induces delight at first and fades in its attraction later on, the same is so for the pleasure of desire. Right. So here he's saying, okay, now go back to the metaphor, go back to the image, right? It's the Buddha statue inside a decaying lotus. And he's saying, all right, why a decaying lotus? Why are we using that for this mental affliction of desire? And now here you can contemplate, you sit down and contemplate. You say, okay, what is that? What is that about? Right? And you say, oh, a lotus, when it first blooms, right? I think it's gorgeous. It looks so pure, looks so beautiful, right? And then later, if you leave it long enough, it starts to stink, actually, right? It like looks all dilapidated and it starts to smell bad. And what he's saying is, that's what desire is like. That we use that, he chose that image to get at something, right? Which is, and you can contemplate this. You could spend months. You could do a whole retreat for a month contemplating this, right? Because, oh my goodness, isn't that like? And there is actually, if you think of your entire history, right? Like, think about everything you ever desired, right? Like, and and you check for yourself, like are there exceptions, like in other words, it's getting at two things. One is impermanence, but the other is this point, it's getting at a point that on the one hand, we desire things because we get, actually, if you go through the whole, I go through the Buddhist psychology of this, just take longer, but it's worth it, is it's the aggregate of feeling, right? You see something, or hear something, or touch something, whatever. There's a sensory experience, and there's a feeling in terms of the five aggregates, a pleasant feeling, right? And then with desire, you think, well, if I can have that, I can keep feeling pleasant, right? Which is already an exaggeration, isn't it? Because it was just a temporary moment, pleasant feeling that happened to arise due to causes and conditions. But the object can't, there is no object that can give you permanent pleasant feeling. It's impossible, right? And so, inevitably, right, because of that process, that psychological process, grasping at the object with desire, you exaggerate the qualities of the object, thinking it can give you permanent happiness. It can't, right? And then that leads to frustration, which is the nature of desire. Right? That's what desire is, and that's what this is getting at. So this is saying that's the metaphor. You can use that image to reflect on your own experience of desire and start to recognize how I frustrate myself, how I harm myself through that exaggerated process. And you understand also that, right, this metaphor is not, you can look at it and go, yeah, it's not saying, oftentimes the lotus is an image of something, wonderful in Buddhism, which is fine, but it's not grasping it, right? The problem is when you grasp with the lotus, it eventually is going to die. It's going to rot and it's going to fall apart, and so on. And that's, so whatever we grasp at is not going to work. That's the nature of desire, right? It's not going to work to give us permanent happiness. Things are impermanent. Things don't exist in the way we project onto them. They don't exist for the purpose of making us happy. Nothing does, actually, right? Things just exist temporarily due to causes and conditions. And sometimes they give rise to pleasant feelings, sometimes to unpleasant feelings, and that's going to continue until we achieve enlightenment. So that's the metaphor there, or the simile there, right? And so again, you can go back and say, oh wow, so I can use that when I contemplate it. Then the same thing, the second one. Just as bees, when becoming greatly agitated, will sting. Likewise, when hatred arises, suffering dwells in the heart. And so this is getting at actually one point that's worth noting here, by the way, I think it's in the simile, is when bees sting you, they die. And so that's one point there is that when we sometimes think, oh, like through my anger, like we get angry and we act out on our anger, thinking it's going to help us, but it actually harms us. It's part of the simile here, if that makes sense. Get that point. And then also, right, it comes from agitation, right? So out of an unpleasant feeling, right, you want to harm whatever you think is giving you that unpleasant feeling. And you wind up harming yourself. Right? Because actually, it comes from mental agitation. Shantideva points that also in the Kaita's way. Anger begins with mental unhappiness, actually, with agitation, as it says here. So your mind is already agitated, and then you project that agitation onto something outside of you. You don't think I'm just agitated because I'm agitated, because my mind has a habit of becoming agitated. You think whatever the object is around you is the cause of your agitation. You want to get rid of or get away from or harm that object. Actually, and you can't, and the reality is if you don't get if you try to harm somebody else, it creates problems for you. And actually, you think, well, it's fine to sometimes temporarily go away from somebody or something, but the reality is that we can't really escape, can we? Because we're, Bob Thurman had this message, which I think he said, samsara is like you're on a crowded, you lived in New York City at the time. He said, samsara is like being on a crowded New York City subway and you're never going to get off. He's like, you're never getting away from those people on your subway car. They're going to be there forever. So you have to enlighten all of them. If you want to have peace, you have to love them all. and help them all become enlightened. Then your subway car will be wonderful. Otherwise, you're always going to have problems. It's a kind of fun metaphor, I thought. So anyway, so you get the point of, and the bees, right? They're trying to protect their honey, right? So they sting, they harm people, and they are thereby also they themselves. The sting, as the bee stings, it dies. So we become like that. And again, it's getting at when hatred arises, suffering swells in the heart, right? You suffer. The main person who suffers, and what it's getting at here is, again, through hatred, you think you're going to be happy by getting rid of the cause of your suffering. Mostly, the result of hatred is you suffer. I say mostly because you do sometimes also cause suffering to others, but the one being who will definitely suffer when you have anger and hatred is you. Actually, sometimes the other person doesn't even know, so they don't actually suffer. Like you could lay there all night, right? Like ruminating and feeling angry, and the other person might be quite content somewhere. So you definitely suffer, and then eventually, if you cultivate enough anger and come across the person, you'll probably cause trouble for that too. But so that's the idea of the bees, right? Then just as the kernel of rice and so forth is covered by the outer husk, so the understanding of the Tathagata essence is obscured by the shell of ignorance. So the idea here is that it covers over and it veils, right? That ignorance, because it's the metaphor for ignorance, right? That ignorance covers over reality, right? And that it's a veil that blocks us from seeing the essence of a thing, the nature of a thing, which is its emptiness. It keeps us from tasting the essence, and sometimes because it's a cover of a seed, right? Usually here the seed is like this isn't like a fruit seed; it's like a grain. These are grains, right? Wheat, barley, is if there's the metaphor in the teaching, it says this, that if it's covering it over, you can't see or taste the essence, which is a metaphor for emptiness, and then also it blocks humans from being able to gain nourishment from it, right? Like if you don't dehusk a grain, you can't make bread out of it or make soup or something. And so and that's part of the metaphor here too, is that when we can taste the essence of the nature of things, that their emptiness, we gain something wonderful, which is liberation. But it's as long as you don't dehusk it, you're not gaining that nutrient that benefits you. Is the idea there. Then the next one was the filth, the fourth, right? We did earlier, the kind of the filth. It says, so just as filth is unpleasant, likewise in those with attachment, forceful arising of the three poisons acts as the cause for reliance on the desire realm, and so is likened to filth. And here, there are a few points. One is, first I'll read my commentary. It says, filth, the idea is it's repulsive. And it's because these kinds of mental afflictions mainly lead to bad karma, which are repulsive like excrement. And then I'll elaborate just a little. Wilhelmina mentioned Lama Zopa Rinpoche. I remember he used to say, when he passed away, of course, but Rinpoche used to use this metaphor. He used to often say, he would, like, because of who he was, he would look around the desire realm, which is our realm, and he was like, he would often say, he would say, it's like playing with excrement, or something. Like, it's gross. It's just like you would look around and you'd be like, you're giving rise to all these mental afflictions which are actually causing your mind unhappiness. And he's like, and you're thinking that's fun. It would look like to him it looked like this. He'd metaphor, he'd realize this point, right? And part of that is like say right. It gets going back to the metaphor, the earlier point about childish beings. Like sometimes, like you have to teach a child not to play with
Put it on the
poop
walls.
or something,
Yeah.
or you have to teach them that, or they won't know. I think Lama Zopa was doing that for, like, he was looking at us like childish beings and going like, I'm trying to teach you, don't smear stuff on, don't smear poop on the wall, and don't eat it. It's not good for you. That's the desire. That's this realm actually. And it's not just, what's the word? Just making that point, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say that equal. I remember him. I was sharing that. So I remember this. He would say that equally, whether he was talking to somebody who was like in maximum security prison or somebody who was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company or was a billionaire or something. Literally, like it wasn't different to him. It wasn't, and that would strike me. I would look at him and he would be like, you would see him like you would see a transcript of his discussion with people in maximum security prison, and then you would hear about him meeting with somebody who was extremely wealthy and ran a huge company, and it was the same for him. It was like you're playing with poop either way. It's like, um, anyway. So that's the metaphor. That's the simile here, right? Is that the things of the desire realm and the mental afflictions associated with those are like poop. The next one, the fifth one, right, which was the treasure buried under the earth, like some poop, but like buried under the house. It says, just as a precious treasure is buried, and one not knowing of it cannot obtain it. Also for beings, the self-arisen Tathagata essence is buried under the ground of the imprints. Here says of attachment, it should be of ignorance, actually. I think that's a mistake. Because earlier it was of ignorance, the imprints of ignorance. So I guess they include the imprints of attachment, so it's maybe not wrong, but it's mostly, I think, in the commentary, it's mostly explaining the imprints of ignorance. So the point is that those imprints, right, in of ignorance cause us to see things dualistically, and therefore block us from realizing the nature of reality. And this is the main obstacle for arhats and also pratyeka Buddhas, right? So it's that kind of imprint of ignorance that blocks you from seeing the Tathagata essence, and it's kind of inert like earth, but it's still, and it's not like poop in that sense. It's not quite as disgusting, but it totally blocks you from seeing the gold that's there. And then the sixth one was like the fruit seed, right? So it said, just as the seedling and so forth, by growing gradually, breaks through the husk of the seed, so the realization of suchness destroys the abandonments on the path of seeing. And that's what I was getting at earlier, right? So it says, the sprouting of the seed destroys the seed itself, right? The arising of the path of seeing destroys the obscurations to be abandoned on that path of seeing, like bursting through the skin of the seed, of that seed. And it's all, those things happen simultaneously, right? The sprouting and the bursting through are like that. So that's that simile. Then the seventh was the worn out cloth, right? So it says, through familiarization with the Arya paths, the core view of the transitory collection is overcome. The abandonment by the exalted wisdom of the path of meditation are illustrated by the tattered robe. So I kind of already said that one, right? The robes are tattered and falling apart because this being is actually on the path of abandoning the afflictions, right? So they're gradually being removed. So it's like a cloth. I was seeing this. I have an old cloth somewhere where it was like it had been in the sun for a long time. It was like starting to. I was like, oh, if I rub it, parts of it are gonna come off on my fingers. I wish my mental afflictions were like that. I guess it's like, I kind of thought that when I looked, I was like, oh, too bad. Afflictions aren't quite at that point. Just touching them will make them fall apart. No, it's not like that. So you get the point there, and right, and the core view of the transitory collection, right? So the transitory collection, we know that we've covered that before, but that's right. There's a transitory collection of aggregates, but grasping at a self, where there's not a self, there's just a transitory collection, right? But we grasp at a self where there's no self, there's just this transitory collection of form, discrimination, compositional factors, feeling, and so on. That's the view of the transitory collection, like grasping at an intrinsically existent self where there isn't one. And so that's overcome by the exalted wisdom, right? Exalted wisdom that realizes emptiness on the path of meditation. Then the eighth, right? The defilements in relation to the seven impure grounds can be compared to defilements of the covering of the womb. Being freed from the covering of the womb is similar to the fully ripened, non-conceptual, exalted wisdom. Right? So you get the point here, right? Is that in this you still can't see the, as I said earlier, right? You can't see the child yet; it's still in the womb. And actually, it's an interesting metaphor, isn't it? Because then the child has to stay in the womb long enough, right, in order to be born. And just so the bodhisattva has to go through those seven bhumis in order, you have to progress through those, and you have to progress through them in order. you know, and oftentimes in Buddhist, actually, I think this is in the, yeah, in Buddhist texts, actually, they have all these, I was recently studying these again, with one of my teachers, Mama. And it was remarkable, right? Because it's like some of these texts were written, you know, sort of over a thousand, well over 1,000 years ago, in India. And they describe, actually, it was weird. They described like we were talking about that. They described fetal development in great detail. Like at this many weeks, it looks like, and it's using these different metaphors. It looks like a fish, and then it looks like a this, and then it looks like a that. And, you know, they're describing kind of, you know, different sizes and when it develops the limbs. They were describing all that. And it was kind of, you know, it was before ultrasounds and so on. But they're just, the Buddhist texts have these descriptions of that process in them. And the point here is, so the Bodhisattva is developing gradually, you know, these different qualities of the 6 perfections, for example. On the first six bhumis, they're practicing the 6 perfections to perfect to a special degree and so on. So they're developing these different qualities, but you can't yet see the child, right? So you know, and the same way you can't yet see the Buddha nature fully when you're on this first 7 bhumis, because you're not yet a Buddha. And then the last of the 9 says, the divine was connected with the 3 pure grounds, right? Pure because there are no mental afflictions. So the 8th, 9th, and 10th bhumis are likened to the covering of a clay mold. And through the Vajra-like samadhi of a mighty one, they are overcome. And so one point is that, you know, they call it there's a Vajra, you know, Vajra is like a symbol, right? But it's a, you hold the Vajra, these symbols. But it's a symbol, actually, there are many levels. About the symbolism of a Vajra, many different levels and points, and each part of it has a symbol. But on a simplistic, one simple point is that the Vajra is connected historically to Indra and the thunderbolt, right? The Indra's thunderbolt. Indra's like Zeus, I guess, thunderbolt. You know, different culture, and so it's this kind of adamantine weapon or something. In Buddhism, you're not having a weapon against anybody else; it's a weapon against your own mental afflictions. But the metaphor here is that the Vajra-like samadhi is the samadhi, the meditative concentration that the Bodhisattva at the end of the path practices. And it's like, so you can imagine like that it's like this, the metaphor here is like if you've got this simile, is if you have this golden statue inside of a clay mold still, if you were to smash it with that weapon, you know, sort of the clay would all fall apart, you know, and the statue would reveal itself. And that you know, in Buddhism, it's never a weapon against, you know, it's not something you're going to hit somebody with. The weapon is your own concentration. And through that concentration on the ultimate nature of reality, at the end of the continuum of being a non-Buddha, smash the clay mold and your Buddha nature is fully revealed at that time. So that's kind of the simile here, the image here. And so it says, thus the 9 defilements, attachment, and so forth correspond to the similes of the lotus and so forth. So we'll stop there, first of all. I remember, but you get the point here. So I just want to, I hope it's clear now. Like, I mean, I said it, but I hope it's now really clear that there's a lot to contemplate, right? And that's what these are for, is that you would actually we'll do it next time again, but you would do meditation sessions, and also like when you're feeling, one is that you could sit and meditate. Another is if you're feeling discouraged or something, right? You think, if you're feeling like, you know, discouraged, or if you're trying to cultivate bodhicitta and you feel, I really become a Buddha, look, I did this or I did that, I have this imperfection, you know, that you would go back to these metaphors, these similes, these images, and say, wait a second, you know, even when the bees are really angry and stinging, the honey's still there. Yeah, I got angry, but that doesn't get rid of my honey of my Buddha nature, and so on. You know what I mean? Like, so you could use these metaphors in formal meditation, but also if something happens in your life, you know, if you're getting caught up in desire, you go back to this image of the lotus and so on. If you're getting caught up in ignorance, you go back to, okay, it's like the covering of the husk, but the nutrient is still in there. You know, I can overcome the ignorance. It is possible to overcome it, you know, and say like, you know, even, you know, actually even a bee has Buddha nature, so I certainly do. And so it's possible, so there are different purposes. One is you can meditate on these in general, but also you can meditate on them if you're like forgetting that underneath your mental afflictions is this Buddha nature. And then we'll do the dedication in a sec. I just want to say something quick. All of a sudden I was like, oh wow, we're quite near the end of the text. So I think we have a couple more classes already scheduled. So, we'll continue on with the text, complete it. And then I wanted to just, so people know, my idea is, first of all, I was sorry to say this earlier, John Yuaki, you had sent me an email suggesting maybe some time to answer questions, like more general questions, and I liked the questions you raised. So one point is I think that's a good idea. So I want to, after we finish, well, it'll be 1 or 2 more classes to finish the text. That's clear, either 1 or 2, I'm not sure. But then we'll have at least 1 more class, maybe 2, I'm not sure, where there are 2 more things I want to do. One is, if people have questions, you can send them to me before the last class, and John, I'll keep yours, and I like them, talk about them a little. But if other people have questions, feel free to kind of bring them as we get closer to the end. And then the other thing I was going to do is something Gyume Khenpo did when he taught chapter 1, which is, the FPMT curriculum is chapter 1 of the Uttara Tantra, so that's what we're covering. But in a final class, I'll also summarize the other, because chapter 1, we've covered the first 4 Vajra topics of the 7. There are 3 more Vajra topics. I'm not going to, those are covered in the rest of the text. I'm not going to cover the rest of the text because that's not part of the curriculum, but I like the way Khenpo Rinpoche did it, where he kind of summarized those. So I'd like to look over that and sort of just summarize how are those other 3 Vajra topics covered? What are the points of them? It's kind of briefly do we're not going to go through the text, but a kind of brief overview of that, so people just have a sense of the whole text, where it goes after this first chapter. The first chapter is most of the text, but it's the longest chapter by far. And it's what Lama Zopa Rinpoche and their Geshes suggested for the curriculum for basic program, but it's just nice to have an overview of what are the rest of the points. And the one thing I'll just mention, I mentioned this to Jan, but I'll just say it very briefly, is so there's still more classes to go. This will be a couple more months probably. We do the rest of the text and then do the question and answer and the summary. But then I was realizing, before, when I was sort of center director, I would sort of choose the next topic based on people's input, but I want to leave it to Jan more because it's not really my role anymore. So I'll leave that so people can, Jan, I want to encourage you, if people can communicate to Jan, their thoughts about that. And Jan's the spiritual program coordinator, so people can kind of do it through her. And I was reflecting, I'll just say this to you, I'll just say it very briefly, is that there are still more topics in the basic program if you want to continue with the basic program. And my own reflection on that, I'll say this now and also in the last class, I guess, is that there are I think it was 3 more topics that are not highest, that don't include highest yoga tantra, and then and then there are 2 topics that are, one that's required and one that's optional. But I'm happy to do anything that's part of the basic program. I'm happy to teach. So I don't think we should do the tantra ones yet because many people don't have initiation. And I won't. I'm happy to teach the one. There's tantric stages and paths, which is a required one that's tantric. And then there's doing a commentary on highest yoga tantra practice. I think if there are some small number of people who want to do those at the very end, I'd be happy to do those as part of this, but it would have to be people who have highest yoga tantra initiation. You can't teach that otherwise. So it'll be a ways off, and by then maybe some people will have that. If there aren't people who have it, I won't teach it. If there are a few people who want to study that, I'd be happy to do it at that time. But that's not for now, because that's, I think, the last thing, and it's also people who only have that. So for now, the remaining topics are Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. That's one. Another one is Death, Intermediate State, and Rebirth, which is a short topic. It would not only be, that's not as long, it's a much shorter text. It's like the 3, so it's like it describes the whole process. It actually is from Tantra, but you don't need a tantric initiation to study it. But it's how do you die, what's the bardo, or the intermediate state, and then how does beings take rebirth. That's the second one. And the third one was chapter 4 of the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which is another text by Maitreya, The Ornament for Clear Realizations. It's another Maitreya text. And that's a long chapter, but it mostly focuses on the FPMT's curriculum says you can teach all of it, but mostly focus on the 37 practices that are harmonies for enlightenment. They call them 37 harmonies, which include like the 4 foundations of mindfulness and other things. So those are the three that remain that are like not, that don't require highest yoga tantra empowerment. And I'm happy to any of those. I don't, doesn't matter from my side. I mean, so if people want to continue with the basic program, you know, Jan can coordinate and people can communicate and we can sort of decide once we're done with this. But I'm happy to do any of those. And I was, and then there is one other optional topic, but I decided I don't think I should, I don't think I want to, the other one, those are the, this includes the optional ones. But there's one more optional, which is the 70 topics. And I studied that, but I don't think I want to teach that one because I think somebody should, if somebody's teaching that, they should have studied the Abhisamaya Alamkara in great detail. And I've studied it some, but I don't think I've studied it enough to teach that really well. So I could teach chapter 4 because I studied that more. But the 70 topics is like a summary of the whole of the Abhisamaya Alamkara. And I've studied the 70 topics, but I just think somebody studied it, the whole Abhisamaya Alamkara for years with better that one than me. So I don't think I should teach that one probably. And it's optional anyway. It's not a required part of the basic program. So so that's the only one I'd rather not teach. But all the others, I've studied them enough. I think I could teach well. Whereas that one, I think I do a mediocre job. So it's not good. It's not
Nonsense line.
I didn't study. I studied it a little bit, but I didn't study the whole text in one sweeping. Like I studied the early parts in detail with Kim Rinpoche in chapter 4, but there are parts of the text I didn't study in as much detail. So, but anyway, so that was just a summary, so people can communicate with Jan if they want to about what they think for the future. But we should do the dedication. It's okay. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, and lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And finally, you know, since we studied this topic today, may all of us have success in removing all those different like obscurations and obstacles that are mentioned in the 9 similes that obscure our Buddha nature so that we can fully manifest our Buddha nature, like that golden statue with the clay falling away. May we be able to fully manifest and realize our Buddha nature without any, you know, and remove all the obstacles to fully revealing it so that we can achieve enlightenment as quickly as possible. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks. Yep, it's good to see everybody. And the other class is already scheduled, I think. So we'll see
Yeah.
if we need more, but we have a couple
3 more
more.
scheduled.
3 more scheduled. So that'll probably be enough, actually. So we'll probably just do those 3. I think that should be enough to do everything we want to do. Yeah, stop this series after that.
Thanks, Lauren.
Oh, thanks, everybody.